Good afternoon, and welcome to this new panel on the Lector in Fabula Festival in Conversano, Puglia, southern Italy. This panel will be about Diagnosis Europe, a viral story of heroes, conspiracies, and the Swedish variant. I'm very happy to host today Iryna Vidanava from Belarus. A journalist from Belarus. You're the editor of CityDog.by and
it's BY.
BY, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
And also a regular participant to the Debates on Europe series. Starting from the left, we have sorry, I'm a bit tired. We have Marina Lalovic from Rai News 24, an Italian broadcast. Catherine André from Voxeurop, pan-European media. Henrik Fredriksson from the German Institute for Language, and also from Debates on Europe. And myself, I am Gian-Paolo Accardo from Voxeurop as well. So we will discuss today about the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it had on societies and on politics around Europe, and specifically on some areas and some countries that had a particular, how can I say, a particular deal or a specific situation with regards to COVID. And I will not waste time and start immediately with Iryna. Because Belarus, and speaking about heroes, which is the fil rouge of this Conversano festival, speaking of heroes in Belarus, there were particularly many heroes, and they were involved in, let's say, the situation with COVID since the beginning. More than a year ago, there was a presidential election in Belarus, a rigged election, because President Lukashenko was re-elected with a huge margin, but in a fraudulent way. And he also managed the COVID pandemic in a kind of odd way. Would you like, Iryna, to explain how it triggered out a kind of movement that made some heroes appear publicly?
Yes, but I will start by stating that COVID began in Belarus as a biggest lie, and then it became a large state secret. And that was a trigger, because in the first place, the authorities just completely did not acknowledge epidemic, a pandemic. There were no news in the state media, and TV is fully controlled by the government, but of course, almost everyone is hooked online, so people knew that something was going on, but the government remained silent. Then there was complete dismissal from Lukashenko himself. We don't call him a president anymore because we don't believe he was elected. So Mr. Lukashenko denied the existence of COVID publicly. He said, okay, maybe it's some kind of a virus, and suggested that we treat it with vodka and sauna or riding a tractor, if you were looking for some recipes. Then there were huge public parades, events, and nobody, including state officials, were wearing masks. So that actually triggered the reaction in the society. At first, volunteers came together. They started crowdfunding for money to buy the masks and equipment for the hospitals and for the doctors. People self-organized to help those who were already sick or dying, especially in the regions. The capital felt a bit better. So suddenly, the COVID became the catalyst of the civic mobilization and democratic movement. So what started as COVID response by the society then developed into this rise of civil society and democratic forces during the presidential election campaign, And then for more than 1 year, it's still going on. So I would say that COVID was a catalyst for this mass democratic movement of mass heroes coming on the stage and being active. So basically, the COVID response by the society prepared the political mobilization that many of you probably followed in August, September, October 2020. I really like the thought of one of the sociologists from Belarus saying that actually Belarusian society recognized itself as political subject because of COVID. And this is a fundamental change, and I would fully agree with the statement. So Belarusian civil society was able to use COVID trauma, which became trauma for us, to strengthen itself. Because after this initial first wave and civic response to it, the government started hiding the numbers. We still don't know how many people were actually sick, how many of us died. We are talking probably about thousands, but every day during several waves of COVID, the government reported not more than 10 deaths per day. So it was kind of Belarusian miracle. So after the mobilization and political uprising and the resistance of the society in its desire to get democracy and to get freedom and to find the truth about the real results of the elections, the government responded with tremendous repression. Belarus hasn't seen it ever. Now it's being compared on the scale with the Stalinist repressions of the 1930s. So we have dozens of thousands of people in prison serving administrative arrests solely for taking the streets in a peaceful manner. We have almost 700 political prisoners, among those who were opponents during the elections, and some of them already sentenced to more than 10 years in prison. So now the government uses COVID as a weapon against its opponents, as a way of torture. The cells in prisons are overcrowded. In a cell which is supposed to be for 5-6 people, you often find 20-30 people. Those are all under political articles, while other cells are empty in that same prison. They are inhumanly treated, and very often you will find somebody infected with COVID and the authorities, the prison authorities doing nothing. At the best case, they would give the person with COVID paracetamol, which of course doesn't help really. They don't put people in hospitals, even if they have very difficult and hard syndrome. And as a result, many of political prisoners, or those who served in prison for 15 days, came out of prison with COVID. And I know these people personally. Henrik also met some of them. So it's really like a form of torture. But then if you think of COVID in Belarus, I would say it's like Alice through the looking glass. While in other countries, the governments were supporting in very different ways, and the public was supporting the doctors and medical workers. In Belarus, medical workers were in the front line of political resistance. They were helping those who were beaten brutally on the streets during the demonstrations. For that, thousands of doctors were arrested, beaten, fired from their jobs. As a result, we observed a mass immigration of the best doctors of the country abroad. As a result, now during the fourth wave, which is already recognized as a fourth wave by Belarusian government, the hospitals are empty. There are not enough personnel there, and people are not getting treatment. Then the government, instead of supporting and thanking the medical personnel, actually announced the Telegram channel where doctors self-organize. This Telegram channel now is announced extremist, which means if I repost something from this group on Telegram and I'm being caught by reposting that, then I can be subject to be put in prison for up to 30 days or longer. Further on, the crowdfunding platforms which were used in the first wave to self-organize and crowdfund to provide this COVID response, they are now all blocked in the country. And the civil society leaders, those heroes of whom you talked in the beginning, Gian-Paolo, they had to leave the country, they had to flee They are all on the terrorist list, actually. But what turned out of this horrible situation, as those people who started this civic mobilization, who now are forced to be outside of the country, they became the leaders of the democratic movement of Belarus abroad. And they're now leading this tremendous solidarity campaign from abroad to bring the better future to Belarus. So it's a very unusual and a mixed story, full of sadness, but also full of pride and hope.
Okay, thank you, Iryna. So, thank you for this this explanation. We'll come back to you after a first round of comments by the other guests. Marina Lalovic, you are from Serbian origins. You are very connected to the Balkans, where you travel very often. So Iryna was speaking about weaponization of the COVID crisis, of the virus, and by an authoritarian regime. So in the Balkans, especially in Serbia, we also have regimes that can be called authoritarian.
So this was the first phase of Serbia handling the emergency of COVID. Somehow a bit of, let's say, emergency made laws, but also in the near Hungary there was a similar situation. And then there is this second phase, which I found much more interesting in terms of, let's say, sociological observation of emergency and of perception of Serbia as a state handling the vaccine distribution. I don't know how many of you remembered at certain point the queues of people going to Serbia to get vaccines, because all of a sudden it seemed that Serbia had all the vaccines, because they actually made available all types of the vaccines. That means Chinese vaccine, Russian vaccine, Sputnik, Pfizer, BioNTech, and AstraZeneca. At certain point, you might remember, like in March or April this year, so only 6 months ago, there were a queue of people going to Serbia to get a vaccine. Myself, personally, I went to report on that. And it was really a good image of handling actually something that the local citizenship didn't want. But nobody said that if you go there, you can book for the vaccine on this e-Uprava, which was a portal, internet portal, where you can book your vaccine even as a foreigner. But on the other hand, nobody actually said that the only availability for the foreigners who were going there to get a vaccine was actually the AstraZeneca jab. And they had 25,000 of additional jabs to handle, which the local citizenship didn't want, and they were about to expire. So they decided to open the borders and to give all these vaccines, first of all, to the, let's say, neighboring countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, which at the time hadn't had any of vaccines, but they were like Austrian people coming as well to get AstraZeneca jab, etc., etc. So, and from Italy, for instance, they were organizing like touristic buses in order to get a vaccine in Serbia. But at the end, there was a disinformation, because you wouldn't go there and choose whatever you want. You would have AstraZeneca or Chinese vaccine. But the question was how many other, let's say, European Union citizens would choose these vaccines at the time. But I think that Serbia really handled in a good way that, availability of AstraZeneca and opening the borders and giving this kind of an image that they are open to give the vaccine to everyone, which can be defined as if we look in the past of Serbia as like a vaccine non-alignment approach. Like all of a sudden, Serbia was introducing both Chinese, Russian vaccines, both Western European vaccines, and all of a sudden they were opening the borders to everybody. So these two examples, in my opinion, made Serbia a very interesting case study on how the emergency can be handled also in the good way in terms of the availability of additional jabs. Now in Serbia we have a problem that people are not getting, like in most of the European countries, or in the world, those who wanted to get vaccine, they got a vaccine, those others, they're not. So now we are having campaigns of pushing people to get vaccines, so they are giving the priority to the local civilization. I will just finish with one poster, which was really also symbolic for the Serbia at the time. It was Hvala ti brate Xi, so it was thank you brother Xi, which was Xi Jinping, because the country who donated the most vaccines to Serbia was China. And all of a sudden, Belgrade was full of these billboards with Xi Jinping and thank you, brother Xi. So we'll see how, of course, the vaccine and emergency was a very fertile geopolitical ground which still stands.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Marina. One would have expected thank you, brother Vladimir, in Serbia rather than Xi, but
there were, in terms of the quantity of vaccines was much more towards Xi Jinping, I would say. Yeah.
It also probably reflects the Chinese strategy in the Balkans of expanding.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Catherine André, you are French, but you work on a media that looks all over Europe. And so maybe you also have a broad look at what happens in other European countries that you monitor besides France. So for you and with your experience, what are the heroes and the heroic behaviors during the pandemic in the countries that you monitored or you followed the most?
Thank you, Gian-Paolo, and thank you for Lector and Fabula for the invitation to this wonderful time we're having here in Conversano, and this interesting panel to look back at the 18 months now of the pandemic, and it seems like an awful long time ago. Thinking about the heroes, I would first, of course, praise as heroes all the people who looked after from the very beginning, all the nurses and doctors and health workers in hospitals and doctors in towns, and who I think were extraordinary in trying to deal with a situation that looked at the very beginning and was presented actually even by governments as not really worrying. And I remember very well, I think it was in January, beginning of January 2020, the French health minister said, it's just going to be like it's a small virus, it's just going to be like maybe a flu, maybe a light flu, and she's now actually in trouble for it. And everybody thought, okay, there's a virus coming from China, it might come here, it might not. And I remember very well as a journalist starting reading, I think it was like in February, maybe, the first reports coming from Italy, from some Italian nurses and doctors starting to write blogs, trying to reach the French newspapers, just to say, we're going through a dramatic situation. It's the number of people being infected doubles every day. We don't have the beds. We don't have any means of treating them. People are starting dying. We don't know where to bury them. And I do remember the French media in the very beginning were very suspicious, thinking, well, people always exaggerate. So looking back in time, the heroes, of course, are first all the people all the health workers, generally speaking, who were at the front for so many months. And in France, and I don't know in how many other countries it did happen, people started clapping at 8 o'clock every day. I think it happened also in other countries, and for many months it looked like maybe the population was going to be reconciled in many ways with the health workers, but also as a means, like people would say, war would reunite a population. I'll talk later about the fact that in France, in particular, the opposite emerged with the huge polarization of the of people. I mean, not only politically speaking, but in society as such. The other heroes I'd like to mention in many, many ways are young people. The students, I mean, they're only now accessing vaccines in many countries, actually, in Europe. And we did, at Voxeurop, we did a series of investigations, articles, just asking students how did they cope with the COVID situation as students, in many countries. Romania, for example, and many Eastern European countries, but even in France as well, people just couldn't go to universities anymore, classrooms were closed, they had to follow courses online, and of course the poorest ones couldn't even afford computers in some countries, so they just couldn't study anymore, and they ended up going back to their parents, which I think means a huge drawback and efforts. But many of them actually still thrived and carried on. They lost the jobs they had on the side, so they couldn't really pay for the studies anymore. They couldn't pay for their rooms. So we did this very interesting series all over Europe, realizing that young people, although in a different fashion in the different countries, because of course some students are richer than others, but all over Europe, I think they experience one way or another a very similar experience, which is, I think, as well interesting to look back at. Maybe I would also like to say that some journalists were heroes as well, because they, even in the Western countries, I think some of them made a very good job, a very good account every day at how the situation was evolving and trying to always go back to the facts. That's something I already said yesterday, but I think if we don't talk about heroes anymore, the big problem I see in France, but in other countries as well, I couldn't talk about Italy, maybe you can talk about it later, but I think the divide between people who think, okay, there might be a virus, but it might not be that dangerous, and they don't trust information anymore. They don't trust facts. And people, I think in some newspapers, journalists and editors tried to stick to the facts, but even the facts were not that easily available in many countries because the governments themselves found it difficult to provide with updates and follow the situation. It's like this French health minister who said that it was only going to be a slight flu and nobody should worry about it. So in 18 months, the way we look at this, we're looking at the situation has changed dramatically. And today, I would say that these are not the heroes, but these are the in a way, I was going to say, no, I won't say it. I was going to say the lost souls, but it's not really what I mean. But I mean, it's not the facts anymore that are important, it's what you believe. So we go back to a society where believing in something seems to be more important than going back to the facts. And as a journalist, I would also say that we don't really know the counter effects of vaccines, and we don't really know, it's like the AstraZeneca, for example, produced a lot of health problems, and to keep telling the facts and querying and changing the way we approach the problem, it's been difficult in countries where you have a lot of demonstrations of people who somehow first gathered on the idea, and then I'll stop here, first gathering on the idea that, okay, we're not sure, we don't get the right information, the vaccines haven't been tested enough, we don't know the counter effect, but then it became like almost a political means of putting down politicians who were already suspected not to be reliable. So there's a huge divide in France, for example, in the French society, but I know you have such demonstrations in Germany as well.
We'll come to the political consequences later. Thanks, Catherine. Henrik, you come from Sweden, and we often in the rest of Europe, let's say, but especially in the south, look at the Nordic countries as a model in terms of everything, mostly because the Nordic societies are considered more developed, more peaceful, more prosperous in many ways, and also with the COVID pandemic, they behaved, especially Sweden, in a different way compared to most of European countries. Can you tell us a bit what happened there? What is the rationale behind this different type of behavior, and what were the impact on the management of the pandemic and also on society as a whole?
First of all, I would say from a Swedish perspective, we are very hesitant to speak about heroes, and I would say that I would not like to point to any special profession or any specific individuals as heroes. There were, however, in Sweden, protagonists, people who played a more important role than others during this pandemic, and most of all, those were civil servants. As in most other countries, I was actually not living in Sweden during these 18 months. I live in Austria, in Vienna, but of course I follow the development there very closely. So every day there was a press conference from Folkhälsomyndigheten, which means the health, basically the authority for health. These are not politicians, but civil servants, epidemiologists, virologists, and so on and so forth. And these were the ones taking the decisions in Sweden, not the politicians, as in every other country, where you had the prime minister or the chancellor or the minister of health or the minister of the interior or whatever it was, standing giving the press conferences. In Sweden, not. It was the civil servants. This is, of course, one could say at least, a rather problematic part of the Swedish model in this case, because there's no way that you can vote away as a citizen in the democratic state or country a civil servant. You can vote away a political party or a politician because you don't agree with the policies that they have implemented or decided on, but you can't vote away civil servants. So the protagonist of this particular Swedish model, not Nordic, and I will come back to that, the Swedish model were civil servants. You could also call them experts. Now, let me first of all crush a myth about this Swedish model. It was not so that there were no measures taken in Sweden. It was not so that everything was open and going on just as normal. No. There were harsh measures, and by Swedes also perceived as harsh measures, limitations for a long time, longer, for example, than in Austria or Germany. The restaurants had to close early in the evening before people started to drink alcohol and whatever, behave like that. So there were harsh measures taken. However, there was no lockdown, as in so many other countries. You said that the Nordic countries behaved differently. No, I would say they didn't. Norway didn't behave very differently from many other countries. Denmark and Finland didn't either. And you can, to some extent, also see this in the figures when you look at the statistics. Sweden, with a population of roughly 10 million, is slowly approaching 50,000 dead in COVID, who have been registered as dying from or with the virus. In Norway, you're around 1,000. In Finland, even less. It's a huge difference when it comes to mortality. And Sweden very early on had a lot of deaths, a very, very high mortality, which of course questioned then this Swedish model. There were some specifics to this, the infection rates and to the mortality rates if you look at different segments of society. Sweden has, meanwhile, roughly 20% that are registered as foreign-born, counting to the Swedish population. That fifth of the Swedish population was extremely overrepresented when it comes to infection rate and mortality rate. Just one example, last summer, about a year ago, and the figures are roughly the same now, but the infection rate, so the number of Somali in Sweden, as born in Somalia, is a little bit under 1% of the total population in Sweden. They were almost representing 5% of the infected. So 5 times more than someone who would have been born inside Sweden. So it's changed and gone down a little bit, and it's lower for some other groups, but still double. The risk to die if you're born outside Sweden is at least double, probably much more, than if you would have been born in Sweden. This has mostly, probably at least, socioeconomic reasons. Socioeconomic factors, the way you live, several generations live in a small space, for example, together, and so on. So it doesn't have to do with genes or anything like that, but it's a fact. And that is something that the Swedish model have tried desperately to handle. Unfortunately, it's so that we see exactly the same pattern now when it comes to vaccinations. And then perhaps we can come back to that later.
Yeah, but so just to come back to the figure you mentioned, you said that were more than 50,000 people dead over
15.
15. Okay. 50 would have been an astonishing figure.
No, it's 15,000 dead, which puts Sweden per capita rather high. However, if you look at, which is a much more credible way of trying to figure out what is happening, look at so-called excess or over mortality, then Sweden is actually very low on that, while countries like Poland or several other countries, of course, as well, rank very high on that list.
Okay, thank you, Karl. Iryna, coming back to you in Belarus, can you talk a bit about the vaccination campaign and how it is going, and if the relationship between the citizens and the government, which is, let's say, the least conflictual, has had an impact on the vaccination campaigns and the vaccination rate and the willing of the people to get vaccinated?
Yes, it's actually very hard to call it a campaign in Belarus, because from the start there was no effort on the side of the government to educate people or to inform them properly about what the options are or why vaccination is important. It's been all very confusing. There were a lot of different steps, one step forward, 2 steps back. So it's still remaining very confusing. We still don't know really the number of people who are vaccinated. The number varies from day to day whenever the government decides to report anything. There are only 2 vaccines available in Belarus. It's Sputnik, not surprising, and Chinese vaccine. No European vaccine has been purchased. And just a couple of days ago, once again, one of the health officials said that we don't see a point of purchasing more expensive European vaccines, which perform as well or as bad as the ones we have here, Russian or Chinese. And nobody asked us, like population doesn't ask us, but the people think that, well, nobody asked us whether we wanted to be vaccinated or have an option to be vaccinated with European vaccines. So it's only 2 vaccines available, which also means that Belarusians vaccinated by Sputnik or Chinese would not do these countries. So you are locked from this perspective as well.
Sorry,
but
Iryna,
overall,
Iryna, Sorry
Yes?
to interrupt, but we missed the last sentences that you said. Can you repeat, please?
Yes, if you are vaccinated with Russian or Chinese vaccine, it's not accepted by European countries, so you can't travel as a vaccinated person. But that's probably the minor issue because currently Belarusian borders are locked, so nothing flies to or out of Belarus from Europe, and you cannot leave by on the ground. But the main problem is actually lack of trust. There was a survey done in August, an independent survey, which states that 52% of Belarusians are not ready to be vaccinated. And 31% of these people said that the main reason why they don't want to be vaccinated is because they do not trust the government. So that's the bottom line in Belarus, that there is no trust, no knowledge, and therefore there is this huge percentage of people, more than half of the population, who are not planning to be vaccinated.
If I may just quickly comment on that as well. This difference in the Swedish society of different ethnic groups, but also different areas where people lived. One hypothesis that seems to be become more and more true is that it's exactly this type of trust in authorities, trust in the state, or trust in science, in experts, in expertise, which is lacking in those communities where authority is rather established within the family or within the community itself, whatever authorities are there then established. And I think that is not only a Swedish lesson or a Belarusian lesson. I think that if you use that method or that way of looking at things, I think that you might be able to see patterns, not least now when you're looking at the vaccine issue.
Yeah, and that was that was what I wanted to ask also to Marina. Did the trust of the population in the Serbian government or in other governments in the Balkans had an impact on the vaccination campaigns, besides the availability of vaccines that you mentioned before? But did it have an impact, and if it did, which one?
With regards to Serbia and availability of vaccines, at the beginning, as I said, most of the people who wanted to get a jab, regardless of the type of the vaccine, because I would like to underline that Serbia actually got vaccines when there were no availability for the elderly, citizens and younger citizens than 60, let's say, in the other parts of Europe. So they started to vaccinate people, like youngsters from 18 onwards, already in January. So this was highly, let's call it a science fictional scenario at a time. With regards to the trust towards government, in Serbia, for instance, it was not related to the trust of the government, but to the lack of trust, I would say, in the rest of Europe that is going on, for instance, now in France or in Italy, towards vaccines themselves. For instance, in Serbia, there is a lot of disinformation with regards of the side effects of the vaccines, that most of all, if you ask the average Serbian why don't they vaccine themselves since they have all this availability, is because that might cause infertility. So this is the main rhetorics, main narrative related to the vaccines in Serbia and side effects. There was a very interesting maybe story to share on, as they had the availability of all the types of the vaccines, they had also the first campaigns in order to convince those who were, let's say, not sure whether to get vaccines. So at the time, there were these campaigns of offering the trips or 40 euros. Now it's very known as a way of convincing people, but at the time they started in April, May. The problem in Serbia now is that there is a very high number of people who are once again infected. We are talking about 8,000 per day on on the population of 7 million. So these are the huge numbers. So the question is whether it is related to those who are not vaccinated, of the type of the vaccines, of the lack of the measures, etc., etc. But we are not here to discuss this. What I want to underline once again with regards to Serbia as a case study, it's a very interesting case study of this promotional aspect of the so-called availability of vaccines and opening towards the whole world and offering apparently the vaccines, which was a good thing because it's better and it's less, let's say, expensive than to throw away the vaccines, which is a very, very complex and expensive procedure. But on the other side, we are in the constant, let's say, political campaign. There are presidential elections next year, so everything is very much connected. And I would say that if we think about the image of the government related to the COVID emergency, it changes. But like let's say in May, June, the current government was the completely, let's say, the winner, because they were the highest number together with UK in numbers of vaccinated people. Okay, so if we draw the conclusions on popularity, I would say that the current government definitely won because of this approach. We can judge it or not, but at the end, Serbia was the second in Europe for the number of vaccines. Now they are approaching a crisis with a, let's call it, I don't know, fourth or fifth wave of infection.
Thank you, Marina. Catherine, André, France specifically was one of the countries in Europe with the highest so-called vaccination resistance, meaning one of the highest rates of people who, when asked the question whether would you be vaccinated against COVID or not, would have said no, or I'd rather not. And it also triggered to a huge political confrontation to some extent. Can you tell us a bit more and explain why and what were the consequences of this?
Well, I think you may have heard in France of the professor Didier Raoult, professor in Marseille, who played quite a big, I think, quite a big role in the media with a treatment that he thought would be the best treatment, you know, and then you wouldn't need to take vaccine if you use hydrochloroquine. And I think I don't know whether that triggered questions about the vaccines, because of course there's always been a number of people in defiance with vaccination in France, I think, but not a very large number of people. What is quite amazing this time, that it seems to grow in numbers, and it's also like almost a tool for a wider political resistance to governmental decisions. So it's difficult maybe in 2 years it will be easier to analyze. We're still in the middle of it, because there are demonstrations every Saturday in Paris, of course, but also in other French big cities and smaller cities, not against vaccines anymore, but against the sanitary pass, which, if you have had the 2 vaccinations, enables you to sit at the terrace of a cafe now in France, and enables you to go to the cinema, enables you to go to university. And university actually was in the beginning going to be compulsory, but it's not anymore. Otherwise, you would have lost the opportunity to study, which should have been a big scandal. But there is definitely a wider and wider divide, with, I may say, a kind of radicalization of a fringe of these anti-vax people, and of course it is also linked to some political ideas and parties, but it's not a bloc. I think it's often described as a group of people with very similar ways of thinking, and I don't think so. I think it's been recuperated for sure by the extreme right wing in France, but you also have people who just don't trust the fact that they inoculate in their own bodies like a substance that hasn't been for sure tested long enough to make sure there aren't any counter effects. But in effect, this will remain, I think, alongside with the COVID crisis and the economic and social crisis, like certainly a change in the way politics can be analyzed in France. I think it's going to be a bit like, I would maybe want to compare it, maybe there would be an outcry by saying that, but with the Gilets jaunes movement, which was also described as a populist movement, but I think behind that there's more. It's not really strictly comparable, because the Gilets jaunes had a lot of social demands on the government. The anti-vax movement is much more about the freedom that people think they can have, you know, as a means against the government imposing all sorts of new decisions on them. And it's true that in many ways, even reporters in France, I don't know whether I mentioned it yesterday when we talked about the freedom of the press, but even in France, some reporters got attacked by the police because they were just filming. They were just filming demonstrators. And there's a law now in France, you're not supposed to put on social networks films or videos of the police in action, you know, against demonstrators. So I think it's still in the making. So it's difficult to look back, but it's definitely a very, very harsh divide in the French population.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Henrik, you are Swede, but you live in Vienna, and you have a privileged kind of observatory on Central and Eastern Europe and the German-speaking world from your very special perspective. Have you noticed similar phenomena in those countries, and what are, in your experience, the possible long-term consequences and political and social of the current crisis in those countries?
Let's see if I dare then to speculate at the end of this comment. I definitely don't want to do it now at the beginning. Speaking about the German-speaking world, as Austria and Germany then mainly, there is a German professor in political science called Wolfgang Schröder, who actually here at the festival presented some very interesting empirical facts about the movement of the so-called Querdenker in Germany, which would in other countries like in France probably be labeled as anti-vax or no-vax movement. And he described how this from the very beginning was an extremely broad and heterogeneous movement, but had with time had been narrowed down and instrumentalized by populist forces, mostly on the right. This does not take away, of course, from the fact that there are some core problematic issues involved when it comes to personal freedom versus mandatory vaccinations, for example. What rights does a citizen actually have to refuse certain things but still enjoy the freedoms of a citizens of a state and so on? Strangely enough, COVID has not been at the heart of the German election campaign. There have been other issues there. As far as the long-term consequences are concerned, I think it's it's too early to say. It goes in so many directions. The reply to this crisis from the start from the EU and from the countries making up the EU was one of everyone for themselves. This was a kind of renationalization. This was the normal or the obvious reflex that everyone had. As time has passed by, it has become obvious that we're not in this alone. We cannot solve this crisis alone. It needs some kind of transnational corporations and so on. So there are very which one of these trends or these sentiments or these insights or reflexes will in the end prevail, I think it's way too early to say, but that there are challenges there for us who believe that transnational cross-border cooperation also on the political level is crucial to handle not only health crises but other crises like the climate crisis or whatever, that we have challenges there that we have to discuss. I think that's clear. That's as far as I want to go when it comes to speculations, I think.
Can I add
Yeah, sure.
something really quickly, because I think it's interesting for the audience to know that in France, if the doctors, nurses, health workers don't have the second jab or even one jab, if they're not fully vaccinated, they cannot work in hospitals anymore. They can't treat patients. And that's a major, I think a major change maybe. Although, you know, when we were preparing this exchange, of course, some vaccinations have been mandatory for a long time, like polio, for example. But it seemed that there's something more in the sense that this is vaccines developed at the heart of very, very long crisis, and with no reflection really, and no knowledge on the long-term effects. So that's maybe the first time.
Marina?
I will just add that something that is a kind of a leitmotif of all these debates on this health emergency is the fact that the society is getting more and more polarized all the time. So not just the society, all the professional sectors and everything. So this is the main consequence, not on the long term, but at least this is our present, that the society is highly polarized, highly divided. And all of us, when we are talking to our friends or even when we are just now at a dinner or something, once somebody starts to talk about the vaccines, how many of you actually witness to get involved in an inevitable discussion? So these are the first signs of a highly polarized society, which really frightens me a lot.
Thank you, Marina. So I would like to end up where we started with Iryna. We are very thankful that you could make it to join us. So what are in Belarus the long-term consequences of this crisis and the management? Do you think that it might have such an impact, even if the Lukashenko's regime is tampering everything down, or not? And no, please.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been very interesting to listen to all of you and to give time to think through those big issues which are specific to each of our country, but also bring up some general topics for all of us. I think the uniqueness of the situation in Belarus is that this huge worldwide crisis coincided at the same time with the largest internal crisis in the country, which both of them coupled might actually bring up some fundamental changes in the society and in the country. It's very, very hard to predict in the long term what effect COVID will have on the current situation and how it will evolve. I can see that the fourth wave will be even more challenging, because now with volunteers and heroes of the first wave being either in prison or in exile, it's very hard to self-organize and help those who are in trouble and those who have virus right now in the country. And the government again shows that it has no intention to take care of the society. So I would say that COVID now became some kind of a background issue that we live in while also facing tremendous political change going on. And again, nobody knows how it will evolve and what kind of situation we will find ourselves in a month, in 2 months, in half a year. So it's really complex now, and it's very hard to. So the COVID thing, as in other countries, it's very political now, but it's not, I would say, in the focus of the public attention, as we are really still fighting for democracy and freedom. Still thinking and trying to get out of prisons our friends and colleagues, and guessing who will be the next target for the regime, and then also fighting the COVID on the background.
Thank you, Iryna. Just a last word on, you mentioned the thousands of Belarusians who are now in prison. Among them, there is one on which there was particular attention in Western Europe lately. That's the journalist Roman Protasevich, who was abducted from his plane, which was hijacked while en route to Vilnius. Do you have any news on him and on his situation?
Well, it's another controversial story, right? First of all, I would not call Roman, with all respect, a journalist. He was a blogger. And I think there is a difference. But as a blogger, he had really, through the Telegram channels, that he was one of the co-founders and editor for some time, he had really big impact on the political mobilization during and after the elections. He was in prison, and it's true that the plane was landed just for the sole purpose to Ryanair flight was landed in Belarus, forced to land for the purpose to get hands on Roman and his girlfriend. They are now seem to be under the house arrest after agreeing to cooperate with the authorities. He is now allowed to also run his new Telegram channel, now blogging basically for the government. So it's, I would say, a sad story. We don't judge the hostages. I would say that he is a hostage. We don't know under which circumstances he agreed to cooperate, but at the moment, this is how it looks. He is not in prison, but he is not free either. And I would just mention that there are 27 media workers, editors, managers, and journalists currently in prison. Some of them already sentenced, some are just sitting in prison for more than 1 year or several months, 6-8 months, for the charges which were made up against them, but because of what they were doing as independent media and independent journalists. And it's an outcry, it's outrageous that this is happening in the center of Europe in the 21st century. But let's just keep in mind that there are almost 700 political prisoners at the moment, and each of these people is not guilty of anything but trying to shed light on the stolen elections and to bring up the democracy in the country.
Yeah. Thanks, Iryna, for remembering that, and also for remembering that Belarus is at the center of Europe and it's not a place far away. We're done. I will thank again very much Iryna Vidanava from CityDog.by to have joined us. I know it's not easy for you in the current situation. And also thank again Marina Lalovic, Catherine André, Henrik Fredriksson, and see you next time.